Hey y'all, welcome back to Ling 201, Introduction to Linguistics. I'm your instructor, Brett C. Nelson, and this is week 3. We'll continue with our discussion of phonetics. Your readings for today were the second half of Contemporary Linguistic Analysis, Chapter 2, Sections 6 through 10. Announcements for this week. On Thursday, the feedback survey, your optional feedback survey will be due. This is to give me feedback on how this course has been going so far. That's on D2L in the survey section. On Friday, your first quiz will be due. That's already been posted. I've gotten some questions about it already. It is indeed open book and open lecture and open notes. So as long as you're doing the readings and listen to the lectures, you should be doing fine on the quiz. So yeah, do that by Friday. Again, we'll start with the land acknowledgement. We're here learning in the area where the Bow and Elbow rivers meet in southern Alberta, a place known in Blackfoot as Mohkinstsis, a name now used to refer to the city of Calgary. This land lies within the territory of Treaty 7, which was signed by this land's stewards, representatives of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda. Additionally, this land is home to speakers of Cree and Ktunaxa, as well as members of the Métis Nation of Alberta. I'm a newcomer to this land. I come from Balbancha, the land of many tongues at the mouth of the Mississippi, the Great River. Before that, my ancestors came from Denmark and France as settlers. I strive to learn more about the land, its peoples, their languages, and their history every day. At the University of Calgary, I hope to contribute to and continue a journey of transformation and renewal in our ways of knowing, doing, connecting, and being, all with the spirit of truth and reconciliation for continued shared enjoyment of this beautiful place. So on the docket for today, we will be diving into the vowel spectra of English. So there's several plural of spectrums being spectra. There's several that we'll have to talk about in order to fully describe the vowel system of English. Then we'll get more in depth with phonetic transcription and the system we'll be using, IPA. We'll introduce the features of sound at a level above individual segments. And we'll discuss common occurrences in speech production. So, last week we talked about consonants and a little bit about glides, which are somewhere between consonants, and today's topic, which is vowels. So vowels are produced with a relatively open vocal tract. So instead of the closure that consonants are built upon, vowels are built upon an opening, in a wide opening in the mouth, and they're defined by the shape of that opening, which is usually determined by where the tongue is. In English, vowels are nearly always accompanied by voicing. It's not always the case, but for our sake and what we'll be talking about today in English, all the vowels are voiced, which means the vocal folds are vibrating. And so as I said, the placement of the tongue body is the thing that determines the vowel quality. It's really the main determiner of the shape of the vocal tract, which is what is the determiner of the sound it makes. And so there are two types of vowels. There are simple vowels, also called monophthongs. So the vowel in a word like hit, that's the wrong transcription. It should be a lowercase capital I. So it has a constant quality throughout the duration. And this contrasts with diphthongs, which in a word like height has a different quality at the beginning and end of the vowel. So at the beginning it's an ah vowel, at the end it's a yi vowel, so height. And so as I was talking about last week, with the semivowels are employed in this system of transcription to transcribe the second half of diphthongs in English. Others would just use another vowel, but for the system that the book uses and that I'll be using in these slides, they use the semivowels y and w. So the quality is determined by several parameters, and we'll be talking about them in turn. So these are going to be height, backness, rounding, and tenseness. So the first of these is vowel height. So vowels can differ by the relative height of the tongue body, and that's why we call it the height of the vowel. Other descriptions of this will call this open and closed. How close or how open the vowel, the vocal tract is. So a high vowel will be closed because the tongue is very close to the to the roof of the mouth, and so that produces a very closed, a relatively closed vocal tract, whereas a low vowel will be called open because it opens up the mouth a bit more. So as I mentioned, high vowels with the tongue body high in the mouth, close to the roof of the mouth. So we have a word like he or a word like who. So both of these are high vowels. Next, we have low vowels in which the tongue body is low in the mouth. So we have at and aw. Depending on your vowel inventory in English, there are two low vowels, and you can transcribe the word aw in two different ways. The book uses the one I have in green here, the second one, but others might pronounce it more like an ah. So I'm not going to check which vowel you're actually using, but there are multiple ways to transcribe words that have that vowel depending on your variety. Between the high and low vowels, we have mid vowels. So this is where the tongue body between the high and the low vowels in height. So we have a word like head, the vowel in head, ed, and similarly with a vowel like ode. So there we have one of those diphthongs that's transcribed with that W symbol as the second part of the diphthong. But it begins with the O vowel, ode. And so if we were to put these on a chart or on this this we see that the high vowel is with these lines, the red line on the top of the tongue, or if you were to lower it a bit, you'd get mid vowels with the orange and the green, and then if you lower it almost as much as you can, pretty much, you get the purple vowels with ah and aw. So this is our first spectrum, and this is going to be vowel height, in which we talk about vowels from the bottom to the roof of the mouth, how high they are. So next, we'll talk about vowel backness. We already kind of alluded to it in the last slide, but here we'll draw it out completely. And so this spectrum will allow us to further distinguish vowels based on how far back the tongue body is in the mouth. You could also call this frontness, the kind of inverse of it. So, as I said, you could have a front vowel as opposed to a back vowel. So it means it's not far back in the mouth, it's in the front of the mouth. And this is when the body is near the teeth. And so we have a vowel like the vowel in need, eed. See, in English, it's written with two e's, but in IPA, it's written with a single symbol, the I, which is written I, but it's pronounced e. Eed, need, e. Another front vowel we have in English is the vowel in leg, leg. This one is has variable pronunciation as well. So you could also transcribe that with the symbol that looks like a backwards 3 or an epsilon in Greek. So that would be pronounced like leg rather than leg. So it really depends on your pronunciation, but it doesn't really change the meaning. I personally say leg. My supervisor has noted at me that I pronounce it that way, kind of unexpectedly, but there are many people in Canada who do pronounce it that way as well, who are from Canada. I'm not. So here on this diagram in red, we have what the tongue would look like at the cross-section. At a cross-section view, what the tongue would look like when you're pronouncing the E vowel in need. And if we would move the tongue backwards in the mouth, we have the back vowels, where the body's near the velum rather than the teeth, in the opposite corner of the mouth. And so these are called back vowels, like the vowel oo in nude, ood, nude, new, nude. That's sometimes written with U in English, but also it can be written with OO, and other really varied methods of writing vowels in English. It's all over the place. But in IPA, there's only one way to write that vowel, and that's with the U symbol, nude. Another back vowel, but it's a bit lower than that U vowel, is load, the O in load. Again, there's many different ways to write this vowel in English, but in IPA, in this system of IPA that the book's using, it's written OW. But we're going to be focusing on the beginning of that diphthong being a mid-back vowel. So it's load, ode, load. And so for an example of what the tongue body would look like for the back vowels, that's what the U vowel looks like, the oo vowel. And again, we can have, because this is a spectrum, we have places in between that frontness, the frontness of the back, the frontness and the backness of these two vowels. We have the central vowels. So between the front and the back, we have central, where the body is intermediate to those front and back vowels. So an example of this vowel would be the vowel in hut, So that's a vowel that's kind of right in the middle and the central part of the mouth, and that's why it's called a mid-central vowel. And so this spectrum measures kind of the perpendicular directionality that the height spectrum describes. So it describes the backness, alternatively the frontness of vowels produced in the mouth. Another way we could describe vowels is based on their rounding. So this is another distinction that we could make on producing vowels, and the rounding refers to how round the lips are when producing the vowel. So English doesn't really do this distinctively. Rather, it kind of just assists the other spectra, and specifically the backness spectrum. So in English, especially in Canada, back vowels are always rounded, whereas front and central vowels are always unrounded. So you might be asking, well, why are we talking about it? Are there any languages that actually do use rounding as a distinctive description of their vowels? And yes, the answer is obviously yes. And the other official language of Canada is French, and in French, there are vowels that can be unrounded or round, and whether they're unrounded or round actually makes a difference in the actual words that you produce from them. So we have front unrounded vowels and you have front round vowels. So in a word like si, if, you also have a word like su, known. And they also have rounded back vowels. So you have a word like su, like a u vowel in English. So you have si, su, and su as three different words that mean three different things. And they're spelled three different ways. And so we call this distinctiveness, or in this case, this would be a minimal triplet, but you could also call them minimal pairs. We'll talk more about what that means and how we use that in linguistics in the phonology section. We also do this in French with mid-vowels. They have front unrounded, front round, and then back round vowels. So we have a word like se versus se versus so. And as I mentioned, back vowels just happen to always be round in French, which is something that's a bit natural in languages, but they don't have to be. There are unrounded back vowels as well. But in French, there are front unrounded vowels, front round vowels, and then back vowels, which are round as well. However, in English, we only have front unrounded vowels and back round vowels in Canadian English. So it doesn't make too much sense to talk about them that way, but it is an important distinction that other languages make, so we'll practice making that distinction among English vowels when we talk about them. And so that just goes to say what is important in one language and how we divide up its sounds or its words or its sentences or just any way we describe a language. What might be important in that language may not be important in another. So you're going to have to be really careful in how you describe certain things in the languages we're talking about, because if you're just mapping it on the distinctions English makes, you're going to miss a lot of things, or you're going to overanalyze things that don't really make sense to analyze in that way in another language, if English does make a distinction that those languages don't. So as something my undergrad professor would always say, it's best to describe a language on its own terms, and often in the language you're actually describing, because it is better equipped to describe itself than perhaps English would be to describe it. That leaves us with our last distinction we're going to talk about for English, and that is the distinction between tense and lax vowels. And so this is a distinction that can really kind of divide basically any of the vowels we've already talked about into pairs of vowels between a tense member of that pair and a lax member of that pair. This isn't really it's not too commonly found in languages of the world, but it is found in English, so of course we will talk about it. So this is sometimes called the difference between a short and a long vowel in English, but they don't have to be shorter or longer necessarily. The more appropriate terminology for this distinction is tense and lax. So for example, an English word like eat is a minimal pair with the pronoun it. So eat and it are both high front unrounded vowels, whereas the first member of that pair, eat, e, is a tense vowel, and the second member of that pair is a lax vowel, it. And so we'll talk about that, why we call it tense and lax in a bit, but before that we'll have another example, bait versus bet. Bait, bet. So as I mentioned previously with the example with leg, sometimes this distinction is being kind of collapsed, and so it creates more homophones because the distinction between those vowels isn't being made, but it's usually made between these two words in bait. So we have the tense vowel, the tense the front unrounded mid vowel bait, and the lax front unrounded mid vowel in bet. So the tense bait and the lax bet. So you could kind of, if you make those on your own, you might be able to tell the difference between and what we're actually talking about between tense and lax. So as I said, this is sometimes labeled as a short-long distinction. However, this technically refers to actual durational differences that don't actually occur in English, but in other languages they do, and we'll talk about those in a bit. So with tense vowels, there is a more constriction of the vocal tract, the oral cavity, and you tend to get more extreme tongue positions to do this. So if you were to draw like two circles in the mouth, the tense member would be on the outer edge of those circles, whereas the lax member would be in the inner edge of the circle that's kind of in the middle of your mouth. So, and we do make that kind of distinction apparent in the vowel, what is this called? A trapezoid? Yeah, the trapezoid, the vowel chart. And so I've highlighted all of the tense vowels there, whereas the lax vowels have less constriction and less extreme tongue positions, so they're more towards the center of the mouth. And so I highlight them in blue here, and they're also not circled. So the circled ones in yellow are the tense vowels, and the blue ones that are left uncircled towards the center and middle of the mouth, which it's not, they're not all central and mid vowels. They're still technically their high front vowels or their high back vowels or their mid front vowels or their low central vowels. They just happen to be more lax and therefore closer toward that center than their tense counterpart. But as I said, that's all you need to describe and to distinguish and describe the English vowels. So you have the height, which is high, mid, and low, and you have backness, which is front, central, and back, and you have tense and lax. And then you also happen to have rounding in the back, and the high back vowels, the mid back vowels are rounded according to this system. But it really depends on what you're doing with that low back vowel and the contrast you make. A lot of people have already collapsed this and have actually started to round it as well. In that case, all of the back vowels in their English would be rounded as well. So there is a vowel we haven't talked about yet here, and that is the middlemost vowel. It's right there in the center of this trapezoid or the vowel chart. This is the middlemost vowel. It's called schwa, and it's that upside down lowercase e. It's pronounced similar to this one, which is pronounced So this is, as I said, it's the middlemost vowel, and it is really just the reduced version of all vowels. So when in a word in a syllable that is unstressed, vowels in English especially, vowels tend to get reduced, and when they do, they get closer and closer, and sometimes they go right in the middle and center of the mouth, so they get close to that schwa. So it's not high and it's not low, so it's a mid vowel, and it's not back and it's not front, it's a central vowel, and it's not round and it's not tense. Because it's not tense, it's a lax vowel. It's just not anything, so it's in the middle. It's just kind of the average of everything. And so it's really special in English because really any vowel can become schwa if it's unstressed. And so we talk a lot about what schwa does in English. So we talked about all of those parameters and how we can describe the English vowels, and now we can actually describe them when we talk about them using those adjectives. And it's always best to use as many of those parameters, the descriptive parameters, as necessary in order to distinguish the vowel that you're talking about. There is kind of a standard order for the parameters of the vowels, and so that's going to go from height, backness, roundness to tenseness. And so you'd say that the oo vowel in lute is a high, back, rounded, necessarily, tense vowel. Whereas the vowel in lit, you could try to say what that is on your own. Let's just go back to so this vowel here, what would you say that is using these order? It is a high, front, unrounded, lax vowel. And so just like that, you just have 4 words. In English, that's all you need is 4 words to describe these vowels, and then you have enough information to really place that on a chart. Even if you're not given the symbol, you can find that symbol using those words. And similarly, you could do that with consonants. So we talked about consonants last week, and we could do those we could describe those consonants by the parameters that make them up as well. So for English, we do this by talking about the voicing, the place, the manner, and then saying consonant. So if we were to, for an example, the first consonant in think, that the theta, is a voiceless, interdental, fricative, non-sibilant, if you want to describe specifically the type of fricative it is, consonant. So it's a voiceless, interdental, fricative, non-sibilant consonant. We could also do the same for the initial consonant and loud, the L sound. So you could either remember what it is or go into the consonant chart that I've linked on our sites, and there's plenty of links on the internet. This consonant is a voiced alveolar lateral liquid approximant consonant. So again, there's various subcategories within these things, but as long as you say voiced alveolar lateral liquid, you'll be fine. And really, in English, the only distinction we make among liquids is between lateral and rhotic. So you could, and that's the only lateral distinction you make in English. So you could really get by saying voiced alveolar lateral consonant. But technically, if you want to talk more about its manner, it is a lateral liquid, which is a type of approximant. So it's a voiced alveolar lateral liquid approximant. And so, with our ability to describe these various segments, we can now transcribe them using those descriptions and the IPA charts. So whereas some linguistics classes and courses require you to memorize the International Phonetic Alphabet, or at least those for English, I don't feel that's necessary. I mean, it's just like a calculator for math is kind of ubiquitous throughout the world. If you have a computer or a phone at hand, you have a calculator, so you don't really need to memorize all of the numbers, although it's a bit easier because there's only, in the base 10 system, you only really need to know the 10 symbols, right? But you do need to know how your way around the calculator in order to do the things that you need to do in math. And similarly for transcribing sounds in this course, I feel as long as you know your way around the tool, and the tool is the IPA chart, then you should be good enough in describing and transcribing segments in at least English, possibly French, and other languages. So this isn't a class that requires you to memorize the International Phonetic Alphabets. What you will need to know is just how those charts are organized, so you know how to navigate them. So here is a chart from the book which has a lot of the symbols, and it puts the symbols that are used for English in boxes, but the official IPA chart looks a bit different than this. It has more lines, but they're constructed similarly. It's just using strict table format rather than a trapezoid for the vowels, or putting lines between the rows and columns for the consonants. But this is a good tool to have. The IPA chart is also good. So we see here on the vowel chart, front vowels are on the left and back vowels are on the right, and you have the central vowels in the middle. On the top are the high vowels, and on the bottom are the low vowels with the mid vowels in between them. And so there are also pairs at each of those kind of quadrants, or I guess they're not quadrants, they're like sextants, because it divides, I don't know, they divide it into 9. But for each of those, you have a pair between rounded and unrounded, but also between tense and lax. So there's a bit more dimensions than just the 2 dimensions. And so it kind of has to double up. And so it just, in this chart, it just describes them with those tense lax distinctions in the chart table, in the cells, or divides everything into unrounded or rounded. So as we see, the tense vowels are on top, the lax vowels are on bottom, and the tense vowels, or the unrounded vowels are to the left, and the round vowels are to the right. And so that's something the IPA chart does, is it puts round vowels on the right and unrounded vowels on the left whenever there's a pair, and it puts a dot in between them to show that it does make there is a distinction that can be made between unrounded and round vowels. The official IPA chart, to make it a tense-lax distinction, actually dislocates the pairs, so that because they are kind of more centralized, the lax vowels that are more centralized and more mid, it puts them within its trapezoid closer to that, so you can see the difference if you look at the vowel chart by just seeing how close they are to that central or mid compared to the tense counterpart at that height and backness. So just to review on the consonant side, we talked about last week, the place of articulation is given in columns along, and so those are labeled along the top, and the manner of articulation is given in rows, and so that's labeled along the left side. And so the place of articulation, the front of the mouth is on the left again, and the back of the mouth is on the right. And then for manner of articulation, it really depends. You could organize it kind of arbitrarily because it isn't really a spectrum, but usually stops are given at the top, fricatives below that, nasals because they do stop the airflow in the mouth as well. However, everything beyond that is more of a continuant sound, and we'll talk more about that, what that means in a bit. But what that essentially means is that they let the air continually flow, and so everything below that is a continuant. So we have trills, flaps, other types of R, so they're talking about an approximate R. Then you have glides, which are called semivowels, or also a type of approximant. So you have the y and the w there in the box, but you could also devoice them into hy and hua. And then you have the laterals, which are a type of liquid. And then you have a lateral fricative, which is just a fricative where the tongue is allowing air to pass through the side rather than across the top of the tongue. And so those are sounds like and doesn't really occur in English, but for some reason they put them in the chart here, so I'll talk about them and produce them for y'all. And of course there are audio enhanced IPA charts available online. You just have to search for IPA with audio, and you could really search for any of the descriptions of these consonants, and you'll eventually find yourself a recording of someone pronouncing those sounds for you to hear, so you know where you're at with those in terms of checking your work and your transcriptions. So we're talking about transcription here. Remember that it's the sound that counts. This is the phonetics portion of our course. It's not the spelling. Spelling is fraught with inconsistencies, as we've seen already with the examples. There's multiple ways to really spell any of the vowels and most of the consonants in English. However, in IPA, there's only ever one way to spell or transcribe each of the sounds that we're talking about. And it's usually one symbol. Again, the exception being the affricates and the diphthongs in the case of vowels, which are just really combination units that are treated as units on their own. So, moving on, if we want to count all those boxes, we'll find that English has about 25 consonants and about 13 vowels. Again, this depends on this particular variety of English. It could have more or fewer consonants and vowels, especially the vowels. The vowels are very variable. And so that's only really a subset of any of those of the symbols given on any of those charts. And so indeed, many more sounds than just the sounds that English distinguishes are possible, and those are found elsewhere in languages of the world, in spoken languages of the world. But again, we can use these same basic parameters we've used here to describe the English sounds to describe those sounds. So we could take a description of those sounds and find its symbol on the IPA chart using that description. So if I were to say, find the symbol for a voiceless uvular stop, you would be able to go in and find on the stop row and then go down or go over to the uvular. And as it says up here, voiceless phones are to the left and voiced phones are to the right. So a voiceless uvular stop would be that lowercase q. And so, yeah, you just go in, voiceless on the left, uvular stop, this one. So it's that lowercase q. And for another example, if I were to ask you to find the symbol for a mid-front rounded lax vowel, so we know it's a vowel. So we go to this table, and we'd say, okay, mid vowels are here in the middle row, and then front vowels are on the left, yeah, and then the round vowels on the right, and the lax vowels on the bottom. So it's this one, this I. And so that's not a vowel that and again, neither of these sounds are in English, but based on what we've learned today, we should be able to find them based on their descriptions because they're using the same parameters in any spoken language of the world. So this vowel, French happens to have, and it writes usually with an OE, but sometimes it doesn't. And so again, we're talking about the sound. There's only one way to describe the mid-front rounded lax vowel, and that is, and so because there's one way to describe it, there's one way to transcribe it. So similarly, if I were to give you a symbol, you should be able to find it, and you just browse the table. But beyond that, you should also be able to describe it based on the parameters of the table. So we have this vowel symbol here. We don't really know how it's pronounced, and but we can find it on a table because it's written. And so here we find it. Now we can kind of build back the description. And so we have a high, back, unrounded tense vowel. And so if I were to ask you to give me a description based on that symbol, you should be able to write a high, back, unrounded tense vowel. Another example, we have this symbol which looks like an upside down Y, but we don't really know how it sounds, but let's look for it. We could look for it in the vowels. It's not really here. There's Y's, but there aren't upside down Y's. So let's go down to the consonants just to check to see if that has it. And here it is. So similarly with that high back unrounded tense vowel, we should be able to work our way back with the description. So here that symbol is. You see it's a palatal place of articulation and a lateral liquid manner of articulation. So and it's on the right side of its cell. So it's voiced, and so it's a voiced palatal lateral liquid. So that's really all you need to be able to do in order to fully utilize the IPA charts. Just be able to know, or just know what the rows are telling you and what the columns are telling you in each of these tables. Again, this uses the tables in the books, but the IPA charts, the official IPA charts, are built on similar patterns. I mean, the front's always to the left, the back's always to the right, and on the vowel, like I said, with the vowels, the height is high. High vowels are high and low vowels are low. Whereas for consonants, that's replaced with manners of articulation, which are a bit arbitrary in how you actually order them. But as I said, stops tend to be on the top, but they should be labeled nonetheless. And so with those labels, you should be able to put things together in a description of the symbols, or the sounds the symbols represent. So we're talking about individual sounds. However, speech in spoken language isn't always a individual thing. Other sounds can impact how other sounds are produced, and there may just be patterns across more than one individual sound that affects all of them in similar or sometimes different ways. So there are these measures that we can make and talk about that aren't specific to these individual sounds. These are called suprasegmentals. It's above the segmental level. So segments are the individual sounds. Supra is above that level of representation. So the first of these suprasegmentals is pitch, and we'll talk about these in later slides. Then we have length and loudness, and these can be kind of constructed with each other to build different patterns or different effects that we call different things, and so we'll talk about them here. So these, as I said, are features that exist above the individual segments. These are called suprasegmentals. They're also called prosodic features because they have to do with the prosody or the rhythm of the spoken language. So as the first of these is pitch, and this has two kind of outputs. One of these is tone, and the other is intonation. And so pitch refers to the relative highs and lows across a speech production. And so every sound has a certain pitch level. However, it's best measured and especially noticeable in sonorous or open sounds, so vowels, semivowels, and the sonorant sounds like nasals and liquids. So as I said, vowels, glides, liquids, and nasals. And so pitch is controlled at the vocal folds with the relative tenseness of the vocal folds giving you different levels of pitch. So when you have very tense vocal folds, you have a very high pitch. And so with relatively relaxed vocal folds, you get low pitch. And so pitch is especially relevant when we're talking about tone. And so tone is a system of a prosodic system in which differences in the pitch signal differences in word meaning. So English doesn't make use of tone. However, there are many tone languages in the world. One of these is really close to the University of Calgary, and that's the Supra language. So we have a word that's written like this with M-I and that belted L, so mich. And depending on if you say that with a high pitch like mil, or mil, it changes the meaning of the word completely. So the highest pitch mil is moth, the mid pitch mir is snare, and the low pitch mir is sleep. So that is an example of tone, where pitch and the differences in pitch give you different meanings. Another example of this is in Mandarin. So we have the syllable ma, giving you different words depending on the relative changes in pitch. So you have ma for mother, ma, I think for hemp, ma for horse, and then ma for scold. So here we have just really what's going on is different tenseness at the vocal folds changing the kind of the pitch. And if you do that over the duration of the vowel, you get differences and kind of change over time of those pitches. And that gives you different types of tones in Mandarin. And of course, this is a very, very small set of tone languages in the world. There could be languages with only 2 tones, or languages with 6 tones, or languages with 8 tones. Really, it runs the gamut. So just know that there are many different ways that pitch can affect word meaning, and when it does do that, you have tone, and so those are tone languages. Another way pitch can affect can come into play with these suprasegmentals is through a system called intonation. So there are differences in pitch in a word. So in English we can have differences in pitch, but those differences don't signal word differences. Rather, English uses intonation to talk about like sentence level differences. So you have, for most speakers, a rising intonation at the end is often perceived as a question, where there are other intonation patterns, where like falling or a falling with a rise, or there's all sorts of patterns in English that when we know English, we know we can hear those differences and kind of assign a meaning higher than the word level to those sentences. And so those pitches or those intonations can add meaning beyond just the ordering of the words in that sentence. And that's intonation. Another suprasegmental is length. So we talked briefly about, I mentioned it, about the long or short vowels in some descriptions of English aren't technically talking about the duration. They're meant to, but they don't always have a one-to-one description of the English vowels. And in other languages, they do. So some languages have segments that are longer than others. And so this is marked in IPA with this kind of triangular colon. This is just the length symbol. And so when you put that on after a symbol in the IPA, it indicates that it's lengthened or long. So in many languages, this length also signals a difference in meaning. So this could happen with vowels. So in the Plains Cree languages, or the Plains Cree language, we have a word like nipi, which means water, versus a word like nipi, which means leaf. So whether or not that e, the first e, is long, changes the meaning of the word completely. The first case we have the word water, nipi. The second case we have the word leaf, nipi. And so this could also happen with consonants. So in Italian, it actually writes this as well, and has this distinction. So we have a word like casa, which means house, versus a word like casa, which means box. And so whether the S is relatively short or relatively long changes the actual word that it is going to, or the meaning of the word that it's with, that the sound is in. If it's short, in this case it's house, and if it's long, it means box. Another example of this is with the R sound. So we have faro, which means lighthouse, and we have farro, which in Italian means spelt wheat. So faro means lighthouse, and farro, spelt wheat. Some languages use length in both their vowels and their consonants. So the classic example of this is the Finnish language. So we have mutta, which means mud. We have muuta, which means other. And we have mutta, which means but. So that T there is kind of lengthened in terms of the length of that pause, or the stop. If we're calling it what it is, it's a stop. So we have mutta. And then you could also lengthen the vowel and the consonant. So you have muta, which means move. So any really combination of those changes the meaning of the actual combination of those segments. And so for that reason, it's suprasegmental of length. And Finnish uses length contrastively, whereas for both its consonants and its vowels, whereas Italian, in this case, uses length contrastively for its consonants, and Plains Cree uses length contrastively for its vowels. So the key here is the symbol, which is that triangular colon, as I said. So the next combination of suprasegmentals we'll talk about is stress, also known as prominence or accent. And so this is the combination of those three elements of loudness, pitch, and length. And so it produces an accent or stress on a syllable. So a syllable or a segment which is more prominent than those around it is called a stressed syllable or stressed segment. And this is indicated in IPA either with that accent symbol, kind of pointing to the right above the vowel, or with this line above and before a syllable to indicate that the whole syllable is stressed. So it's a very vague term because stress, the specific effects of stress varies across languages. English is a stress language. So in some languages, and so is Spanish, and so in some languages, including the English and Spanish, it creates meaning differences. So in Spanish, you have stressed syllables that are higher and slightly louder in terms of their loudness and pitch. So you have a word like papa, which means dad. However, if you were to stress the first syllable of those segments, those syllables, you'd have papa, which means potato or pope. And luckily enough, Spanish in its orthography does indicate the difference, and it happens to be a difference that is an indicator that is acceptable in IPA with the accent above the vowel. But again, you could also put it above the syllable. So you put it right here above the second P in the first example, whereas with the second example, you put the bar or the line above the first P for papa. English also makes distinctions based on where the stress in a word is, and it actually creates more differences. But for a simple example, we have a case like these two words in which the louder, higher, and longer vowel is the stressed vowel, and its syllable is a stressed syllable. And so in the noun insult, that stressed syllable is the first vowel, the first syllable, whereas in the verb insult, the second syllable and the second vowel is the stressed one. And that's a common pattern in English. Verbs tend to have their second syllable stress, whereas nouns tend to have the first syllable, and there are many pairs like this in English that differ only by stress, and it tends to follow this pattern where if the stress is early, then it's a noun. If the stress is late, it's a verb. So as we talked about, the unstressed syllables in English tend to reduce, and so they become more like schwa. So in the word reduce, the stress is going to be on the final because it's a verb. It's not a set pattern, but it's really close to being a predictable pattern in English. But the second syllable is stressed, so the first syllable is unstressed. And when we have our unstressed syllable in English, its vowel goes towards schwa. So you can say reduce, but most speakers are going to reduce that first vowel into reduce. So that schwa vowel is formed from that high front vowel, e to reduce. So all of these factors are at play when you're actually producing speech at more than a single segment at a time, which is, I think, the vast majority of spoken languages produce speech more than one segment at a time. And so while we can break speech down into those discrete segments that we've started out with and we've built to bigger units, when segments come together, there are effects that take place in the production of those combinations of segments. And then so we can observe those and describe those effects in various ways, and linguists do. Especially in rapid speech, one segment's articulation may begin before the end of another articulation. So if, for example, this would be called co-articulation. An example of this would be the initial sounds in private. You could probably feel your tongue move towards the alveolar ridge while you're producing that closure at the lips, because it's available to do so. This is one of the few sounds that doesn't use the tongue, the p sound. And so while you're making that p sound, your tongue is getting ready to produce the r, and sometimes that can occur while you're producing that p. So you have private. So this is kind of just the simplest, where you're just producing more than one sound at once. But in doing so, you can create other effects, and these are called speech production processes or processes. One of these is called assimilation, where one sound becomes more like another. And so in a word that's written like can't, we have that vowel symbol, which is the low front vowel, eh. However, before an N, it takes on kind of that nasality, because you're opening up the back of the mouth to allow air to pass through to get ready to produce that nasal sound, which is how nasals are produced, because air is flowing through the nasal cavity. And when you do that while you're producing a vowel, it is said to nasalize that vowel. So when we transcribe can't, we would transcribe it with that tilde above the vowel, and that indicates that it's nasalized, and that nasalization is coming as an assimilation towards that nasal consonant which is following it. The opposite of an assimilation is dissimilation. And so this is when one sound becomes less like another. So a frequent occasion of this is any of the words that are produced with th, the numerals. So we have the word like 5, and then you add th to get fifth, and then you pluralize it to get fifths. You have 3 fricatives in a row there, which can be difficult to produce. So some speakers might say fifths, or just drop that sound completely and say fifths. Either of those is the case of dissimilation, because what you're trying to avoid is having 3 fricatives in a row. And so what you do is you change that second fricative to break that sequence up, either into a stop or to remove it completely. In that case, it would be called a deletion that's caused by dissimilation. So fifth become to fifths, and deleting that middle segment would be fifths. And many speakers do this kind of regularly. A case of dissimilation in English. Then we have deletion, in which, so this is what I was talking about. A sound goes unarticulated. It might still be there, but we don't need to transcribe it because it's not being pronounced. And this happens a lot, and it's really made its way into how we write English with the sentence, I don't know. Kind of said rapidly, you say, I don't know, I don't know. And you can write that in English like this, D-U-N-N-O. But in IPA, we could indicate it like this. So we have that diphthong for I, then we start with the, no. And we see, even though in kind of the most fully written out version of English, we write that T, since we don't transcribe it, or don't pronounce it, we don't transcribe it. So there's no trace of that T here. We just have the N followed by the O. We have the first syllable duh, no T, no N. And then, so when those N's come together, we just write it with one N, because it's not really long. So I don't know. But you could, I guess, lengthen it. But again, English doesn't make that distinction. So, but it does write it here with I don't know with 2 N's. In IPA, we write it with 1, because it's not a distinction that English needs to make. The opposite of a deletion is an epenthesis, in which it's also called an addition or an insertion, in which an extra sound is added in order to break things up. So we have a word like prince, and if you think about how you pronounce that, when you pronounce the word like prince, so the plural of print, you might notice that it's pronounced similarly. Either prince is pronounced without the T, in which case it's a deletion, or prince, the royal person, is pronounced with the T between the N and the S sound in order to break up those continuant sounds with a stop at the alveolar ridge. And because it's a stop at the alveolar ridge, it's an alveolar stop. So you get, you would write that because you're stopping the air there, and so it's prince. Really, speakers can do both. So you have to listen really careful to what they're producing, because you might not even perceive that difference. But phonetics really concerns itself with those the specific differences and whether things are inserted or not, or pronounced, really. Another speech production process is metathesis, in which two sounds are swapping positions. So we have this is a common occurrence in many Englishes. You might think of African American Englishes, but a lot of Englishes do this. Historical Englishes do this. But in a word like ask, with SK sequence being pronounced instead with a KS or an X sequence. So ask becomes ax. This is a metathesis of those two sounds, just because it might be easier to put that S after the K. And really, that's the goal of these processes, is to make speech production as easy and uncomplicated as possible. However, what's contrasting with this, or fighting against this, is your ability to be understood. So what's fighting against this ease of articulation goal is that want to avoid ambiguity or homophony. So in a case like ax, it doesn't really, it creates a homophone with the verb or the noun ax, and it's not really a verb, not often. And so there isn't really that pressure to avoid saying, I'm going to ax you something, because most listeners would understand that the only verb there that really makes sense is ask. And so a lot of listeners, you should understand that as that verb ask, rather than, for some reason, the noun ax being there. So that's what we'll leave off with this week, because it really feeds into what we'll be talking about next week with phonology. But that's the end of Chapter 2, Phonetics. So the readings for next week will be the first couple of sections of Chapter 3, Phonology, and the appendix of Chapter 3, which happens to talk about how we analyze some of these speech production processes. In terms of announcements, again, the feedback survey is due. It's not required. If you've already done the quiz, then I'd be more than happy to implore you to fill out the feedback survey so we can improve this course and make it as functional and efficient as possible for your learning. But if you haven't done the quiz, note that the quiz 1, which is due on Friday, and it's on what we talked about this week, and as well as what we talked about last week. In other words, phonetics. So that'll be due on Friday by 11:59 p.m. So make sure you submit that because it is a part of your assessment. So that does it for today. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you all next week.